Okay, welcome everybody. And this is the Coffee with Friends event that's put on by the Monroe County Public Library and presented to you by the Friends of the Library. So I'm Patsy Ron, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors for the Friends of the Library Foundation, and I'll be hosting today's event. We're delighted today to have as our guest author, the historian James Madison. We will be discussing his latest book, The Ku Klux Klan in the Heartland. Now, there will be times at the end for discussion, so if you'd like to ask a question, go ahead and type it in the chat section. And since we are recording this, if you'd like to take your image off, go ahead and hit stop video, and then we won't have your image on. A couple of announcements before we begin. Hopscotch Coffee, located on the Beeline Trail, has graciously joined Coffee with Friends this month, and they're offering you a special if you go there and say you're a friend of the library. So you have one more week to get that special at Hopscotch Coffee. Also, starting Monday, that's tomorrow, the library is going to reopen for browsing, and on Tuesday, the bookstore in the library will be open again. And for further dates and times, you can check the website. And you are always welcome on the website to become a friend of the library. That will get you updated information on all our events, and any contributions you can make, small and large, are greatly appreciated. So before the program begins, I'd like to just say hello to our audience. We have over 200 people here today. So I don't know if we can bring that up. We're trying to show you some of the audience members out there. And thank you all very much for coming. So now I'd like to introduce our guest author, James Madison. James Madison, also known as Jim Madison, is the Thomas and Catherine Miller Professor Emeritus of History at Indiana University. He has received several teaching awards, including the James P. Holland Award for Exemplary Teaching and the IU Student Alumni Association Student Choice Award. Recently, the Midwestern History Association honored him with the Frederick Jackson Turner Lifetime Achievement Award. Jim Madison has also taught as a Fulbright professor at Hiroshima University, Japan, and at the University of Kent in Canterbury, England. He is the author of the following books: Eli Lilly, A Life, A Lynching in the Heartland, Slinging Donuts for the Boys, An American Woman in World War II, World War II, A History in Documents, and The Indiana Way, A State History. Also, Jim will be giving some talks and formal book presentations at other Indiana libraries coming up in March. I'll just give you the name of the libraries. You can look up on their websites the time and other information. He'll be on March 8th at Jackson County Public Library, March 12th at Zionsville Public Library, on March 21st, Hamilton East Public Library. So today we are also very fortunate to have with us not only Jim Madison, but also Carolyn Calloway-Thomas, and she will facilitate the discussion today. She is chair of the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Indiana University. Her research focuses on the rhetorical intellectual history of Black Americans, intersections between empathy and race, intercultural, interracial communication, and the pedagogy of empathy and civic engagement. Her recent publications include Empathy in the Global World, an Intercultural Perspective, and her co-authored book, Intercultural Communication Between Chinese and North Americans. In 2018, the Central States Communication Association created a Carolyn Calloway-Thomas Inclusivity Speakers Series in her honor. So welcome, Jim Madison and Carolyn Calloway-Thomas. We are very much looking forward to your discussion.
And greetings to everyone on this warm, beautiful day in Bloomington. And thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to have a conversation with James Madison, an outstanding historian and author of the thoroughly researched book, The Ku Klux Klan in the Heartland. which will shape our conversation today. When I arrived at Indiana University as a graduate student some years ago, Ronald Bingham, the resident assistant in Eigenman Hall, within a nanosecond, greeted me with the following words: "Don't go to Martinsville." Then, as I moved slowly through the revolving door with a piece of luggage trailing behind me, Ronald began to recite a cruel story, the story of the KKK's ugly reign in Martinsville. He told stories of how the KKK had killed a young African-American woman who was selling encyclopedias from door to door. And then he recited and enlarged upon this narrative with other compelling, traumatic stories of the stealth and ruthlessness of the Klan, the whippings and maimings and shootings and cuttings by the knife, by the rope, and by the whip. From that moment on, whenever I went north to Indianapolis, whenever I arrived in Martinsville, my heart moved into my throat. Of course, I thought at the time, and still think, that it was a bit unfair to blanket a whole town in that fashion. However, for many African Americans, the KKK evokes a reign of terror across generations, and it is almost impossible to find too many African Americans who do not tremble when the name of that secret organization is mentioned, the KKK. So, Dr. Madison, I wanted to open with that autobiographical story, however briefly, to illustrate the terrorizing reach of the Klan. However, upon reading your compelling book, I was surprised by many things inside the book. Chief among them is the following sentence found on page 109. The Klan was seldom violent. In a localized sense, meaning in Indiana. So, given the history and reach of the Klan, could you please first tell us what route led to your work on the Klan? Of all the pretty stories that are out there, why the KKK?
Well, thank you, Carolyn, and thank you for being part of this conversation. It's a little dangerous to put two longtime professors in the same virtual room, but we're going to do our best, Carolyn and I. I want to thank the Friends and the public library. Our children grew up in this library, and it truly is one of the great jewels in the Bloomington community. We are blessed to have a world-class library in this town. Let me just summarize quickly some of the main points of this book, and I do want to get to Carolyn's very important point about trauma and about the enduring consequences of the Ku Klux Klan. We don't like to talk about this stuff much, white folks especially. And for a long time in Indiana and in America, we didn't talk about the Klan. We were silent, assuming it would go away. Or even worse, we create these alternative stories. We create these myths to cover up the tragedies of our past. We tell bedtime stories that give us comfort. Patriotic history, the recent president called it. And so this is, to me, a story that needs to be told and needs to be understood and talked about as we're talking about it today. A couple of quick points. Who joined? 100% Americans, they called themselves, native-born white Protestants who believed they were God's chosen people. They were the normal people. They were the good people, and all others were not. The others, Catholics above all, the chief enemy of the Klan in Indiana in the 1920s were Catholics, and of course, Jews, and of course, African Americans, and certainly immigrants as well. Those were the enemies. heightened by the fad, the phase in scientific communities and universities for eugenics. We have it here on our own campus, as those of you following IU know. This is an organization, the Ku Klux Klan in Indiana in the 20s, that became very powerful in social life, cultural life, especially religious life, into partnership, close partnership with the Protestant churches, Methodists, Baptists, Disciples of Christ, and eventually very powerful in politics. In 1924, a majority of candidates in the 1924 elections were Klan members who then went to the Indiana General Assembly. The governor was a Klan person in 1924. A powerful organization which divided people into 100% Americans and those who were others, who were them, who were not part of the community, part of the tribe. Was there opposition? I have a whole chapter on that question. Yes, there was. I'd like to say that lots of people stood up to the Klan, but most either joined the Klan or remained silent. There was some opposition, courageous individuals, some groups. None of the Protestant denominations in their state conferences stood up and condemned the Klan. A few organizations, other organizations, and some individuals did. It took a long time for the Klan to go away. It finally did in around 1930. It's pretty much dead and gone in Indiana, but it had a powerful, powerful reign that left behind feelings, emotions that made it normal and respectable to talk about those who were not 100% Americans in ways that we today, all of us, I'm sure, would find and do find abhorrent. The Klan came back in Indiana and in the North in the 1960s, the South too, and burst out in rallies and marches, even here in Bloomington, in the last half century. That's a very different organization. They are a bunch of unteachables and rubes, white supremacists mostly, though they have other enemies. It's not that Klan that we see even today in robes and hoods. It's the ideals of the Klan of the 1920s, expressed in all sorts of ways. When Bill Garrett played basketball at Indiana University in Bloomington and Ann Arbor and Evanston, he was the only African-American player on the court. In 1953, when IU won the national championship, there were no Black players on that team. In all sorts of ways, the ideals of the Klan persisted and in some ways intensified after the civil rights movement of the 60s, created space for white supremacists to come out of the woodwork and to claim things about America that were simply untrue. And so we have heirs of the Klan today, and not just in the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the others, those who showed up at Charlottesville in 2017, those who showed up on January the 6th. And maybe Carolyn and I will get to that conversation, and maybe you have questions about that too. I'm quite happy to talk about the recent past and about today, with only the caveat that when I talk about the recent past or today, I'm not speaking as a historian or a scholar. I'm speaking as just an ordinary citizen who has opinions, in fact, very strong opinions on this. Indeed, I have a little sticker on my computer here. It says, "Stay calm, Madison. Don't get too wound up about this stuff. If Carolyn tries to jab you, stay calm." So that's a kind of overview. And if you do want a full book talk, Patsy gave you some of the public libraries where I'll be doing a full book talk with slides and all the other things. So that's by way of introduction. Trauma, you bet. And for African Americans, I know this, you all know this, we know this. For African Americans, there's a special, special trauma. It's testimony to the power of the Klan, which was a brilliant marketing propaganda organization in the 1920s. Far more sophisticated than the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers or a lot of their other compatriots today. Very sophisticated. And they were superb at creating an image of the burning cross, the hood, the robe, and all the stuff, all the statements and values that with it, that still, almost 100 years later, have the power to create feelings for all of us, and trauma especially for African Americans who in their own families have stories. They may not all be true, but they are powerful stories about this organization. One final point. We'd like to, and this was the tendency for a long time, even among historians, put this Klan of the 1920s as at best a sidebar in our history, a fluke event, not worthy of much consideration. I think it's the main story. In fact, I can recite the first sentence of this book. The Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s was as dark as the night and as American as apple pie. That is discomforting, but it's essential for a democracy that we understand that. Okay, that was a lecture, Carolyn. I said more than I wanted to. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. But Jim, that's very troubling, that statement. The darkness statement is very troubling. And it's troubling because when we think of the Klan, the super story, the super myth is that the Klan was comprised of the ignorant and the unwashed.
Yeah.
And yet your book tells a different story altogether. For me, that's what's so terrifying about it. Is
You're
that
right.
particular find.
And that you can't understand anything about the Klan or about issues today, I believe, without understanding that fundamental point. And we have lots of serious historical scholarship on that question now. If the people who joined the Klan in Indiana in the 20s were the great unwashed, the ignorant, the rubes, the unteachable, someone called them in the 20s, then it's easier to dismiss them. They're not really us. They're not good people. And, you know, stupid people do stupid things.
Mhm.
That's not true. They were middle-class, ordinary Americans, good church women, lawyers, ministers, shopkeepers. And that makes the story, as I've argued, central to American history.
Now, Jim, although you outline beautifully the compelling reasons why the Klan was talked into existence, I still would like to hear more about what was that special elixir? Why Indiana?
Well, it wasn't just Indiana. The Klan was more powerful in Indiana than in most northern states. But there was powerful Klan claverins from New Jersey and New York, across the Midwest, especially in the Midwest, all the way to Oregon and California. This was a nationwide organization in the early 1920s. It was powerful in Indiana for a lot of reasons, and I try to lay these out in the book. But I think one very important one that's relevant today is that Indiana, I said this in an earlier book, in the 1920s, was blessed with perhaps the most mediocre leadership in all of its history. Some would say that's a pretty low bar. They're just in the 1920s. We're not leaders in the state, in politics or churches or elsewhere. We're not men and women of courage and principle. There were a lot of seekers of the main chance, and they created that absence of leadership. I believe created a vacuum that allowed an organization like the Klan to move in and create an immense power base.
Thank you. Now, one of the lessons we learned from Joseph Goebbels and the twisted propaganda machine that he invented is that as a whole, if a leader is to be efficient, he or she needs to prevent the division of the attention of a people. He or she needs to concentrate attention on a single enemy. Explain some of the symbolism of the Klan that made that rhetorical device work so compellingly and in a unifying way for the membership.
Yeah, well, I think the Klan leadership was brilliant at creating these enemies, magnifying them, giving them far more power than they had to make them dangerous. These people, Catholics, immigrants, Jews, African Americans, were causing the downfall of America. This was very serious business, and we needed to step up and stop them. from what they were doing, or we're all finished. The Klan was really good at propaganda long before the Nazis created a world-class propaganda machine. One of Goebbels' assistants, I taught a class on World War II, and I had an interview that I showed the students about where one of Goebbels' assistants talks about this. And he says with his thick German accent, the secret of propaganda is to lie, lie, lie.
Mm-hmm.
And the Klan was really good at lying.
And repeating, repetition.
And just repeat it, just say it again and again. The weekly newspaper, the Klan weekly newspaper, the Fiery Cross, it's digitized, anyone can read it, is just repeats the same old nonsense. I spent 3 years reading that nonsense, you know, just repeat it. But here again, we have a principle, a method, a style, lie, 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 that I need not tell anyone paying attention today. We've seen in our own lives in recent years in a major kind of way. We can all spell QAnon.
Yes, a big focus of the Klan was on the question of identity and belonging, about who was an American, about who we are as Americans. As you think about the Klan, could the Grand Dragon, Stevenson and others, have framed their argument around something other than what constitutes an American? Could you talk about that for a moment? Could there have been some other rallying issue or symbols that they might have used rhetorically?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I haven't quite thought of it that way. I need to think about that some more, Carolyn. Thank you. I think one part of the answer there is that the Klan, while they're very sophisticated and smart and successful for a time, didn't really create much new. They picked up the stuff that was in the culture, that was in the air, that was in our history. Anti-Semitism comes from Western Europe, across the Atlantic. Anti-Catholicism comes from Western Europe, across the Atlantic to Jamestown and Plymouth. This stuff is deep in the culture. Denigration of African Americans is there from 1619 in all sorts of ways, but the Klan was brilliant at pulling it down or pulling it up and putting it on the platform, the theatrical platform, the bully pulpit, and of saying it in ways that had salience, that caused people to say, yeah, I think they're right. Now, what other enemies could they have had? Well, it's hard to think. Those are the big ones. There are always other possibilities. And later on, we discovered other kinds of immigrants or enemies. You know, later on, the Klan, in fact, in the 1980s and 90s in Indiana, began often to add LGBT people to their list of enemies, while they focused on African Americans as the number one enemy in our recent past. So that's a very interesting question.
It is fascinating to see how in the 19th.
What do you think? Do you have other possibilities?
I don't. I was hoping you were going to answer that question for me. But with regard to the work of the Klan, their messiness, the nastiness of the Klan, it raises the question of the extent to which those of us who see ourselves as virtuous people need the myth of the KKK and other white supremacist groups for evidential reasons to cement our loveliness, to make us know and understand that we are lovely people and that those people are not lovely people. So I'm trying to imagine a scenario where we don't have these hate groups reminding us of the nastiness of our past. What then? What would we do?
Well, that's a wonderful. Are those your words? Cement our loveliness? I love that. Did someone else say that, or is that for?
That's Carolyn speaking.
Boy, I'm going to steal that from you. I love. We cement our loveliness by showing the despicable qualities of those other people lesser than us. And you know, we should always, shouldn't we? Always look at our own house. and be careful of throwing rocks because we all live in glass houses. And I think, I've been in Bloomington since 1966 mostly. And I think we have a special tendency to think here in Bloomington, we're special. We live on an island, and especially at the university, we're all so wonderful and lovely. I need not tell any of you who are paying attention, we have issues and problems here in Bloomington and at IU, not just in those other places like Seymour, Indiana, represented by Jim Lucas. Follow that story if you wish. So yeah, I think there is something about that. I used to, when I talked about these sorts of issues in class, Carolyn, I'd get the students started by saying, well, we IU people, and even more back in the day, we IU people, we hate Purdue. Well, that's not even a university, much less a basketball team. It's us and them.
Mm-hmm.
We are the imagined community, we IU people and Purdue. And there's something maybe human about that. Maybe as humans, we need some of that. The positive aspect of it is identity with other people, this community, this beloved community, this imagined community that we connect to other people, even if we don't see them face to face. And there's something very, very good and necessary and positive about that. But when we need to create that community by stigmatizing others, by excluding others, then of course we're on a slippery slope downhill. And that's exactly what the Klan did. Why this term 100% American, which the Klan popularized, is so powerful, so horrible, and yet so prevalent, so very prevalent in our own time.
Now you talked a bit about us and theming. And I want to know, is there much hope that our tendencies toward us and theming, human clannishness, tribalism, and xenophobia can end in human societies? Because I think we know that research indicates that by the age of 3 to 4, kids already group people by race and gender and have more negative views of such. So how might we tame such seemingly natural inclinations, as you alluded to just a moment ago?
Yeah. Well, Carolyn, we're in the business of education, and this is maybe a self-serving cheap shot, but I think the answer is education, education, education. Kids need to learn. As that wonderful old song, you need to be learned to taught to hate. I have 4 grandkids, and I'm very impressed by what they're learning in their schools and in other forms about the world. They know so much more than I knew at the age of 10 or 12. And they don't seem to have these kinds of deep notions of us and them. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that young people, I'm hopeful that many of the people who turned out in the Black Lives movements in the last 12 months are helping all of America to move away from us and them. At the end of the day, I'd like our conversations to be about what divides us, about groups of us, and we identify in all kinds of groups. I mean, I'm left-handed, and 10% of Americans only are left-handed. We're a minority. We have all sorts of problems. I want to talk about left-handed people. But I think we also need to talk about the human beings of the world. We need to talk about human rights when we talk about left-handed people and their plight in life. We need to move the conversation. We need to step back and think a little about where we are in time and space and in culture and in our own lives. That's hard to do, but that's what education is about.
So in a perverted way, were the KKK members also saying, this is a beautiful country? The story is told that when John Brown was en route to his death, that he looked around himself and saw the beauty of the country and said, this is a beautiful country. So to what extent, if any, can we privilege any of this perversion?
Yeah.
And
Well,
that,
it is a beautiful country. And, you know, I started off talking about our failure to deal with our tragedies and the dark sides of our past. And there are many, many bright sides of our past and of our present. We have many heroes, real heroes in American history. We have people who stood up and did the right thing again and again, and they are celebrated and ought to be justly celebrated, and more of them ought to be brought forward and celebrated. I when I do a formal book talk, usually the last slide is a photograph of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., with Lincoln on the throne and my 4 grandchildren next to him. And I often quote Lincoln, not that this is the greatest nation on the world, not that we're exceptional or better. What Lincoln said was that America is the last best hope of the world. We have these amazing ideals. We have this hope, unrealized yet, but it's there. And that is the beauty. And I think that may be some of the beauty that John Brown saw at Harper's Ferry. I think that may be some of the beauty that those participating in the Black Lives protests saw and see. It's certainly what I see.
it seems also that nestled inside the very fiber of the KKK is the question of ownership and appropriation. You know, who gets to own what, when, how, and with what effect? And so today, as we think about what's happening with cancel culture, do you wish to comment on any connectivity between what the Klan members were doing in the 1920s and this whole notion of being woke and canceling things that we don't think ought to be privileged today? Is that too far away?
We need another hour to talk about that, to even scratch the surface there, don't we? Well, the Klan certainly thought they were America. And let me not beat around the bush here. I think there's a wonderful essay in the New York Review of Books this week where the author, an Irish commentator, writes about the Trump people, and many of whom believe that they are America.
Mm-hmm.
They are America. Others are not. I guess I'm not. Woke, well, I'm glad to see some white folks are waking up. But my question would be, why did it take so long? Where have you been? Why are we so slow and reluctant to wake up, to face our past and our present as honest citizens? I'm glad to see some rays of hope and progress, but it's awfully slow and late in coming. You know, Martin Luther King said this in 1963. Lots of predecessors have said this, in the African-American communities especially, for a long. Frederick Douglass said it in the time of Abraham Lincoln. Why is it taking so long?
Mm-hmm.
What is there in the American culture, in white America, that takes so long?
Yes, and it's fascinating to see how Stevenson and other members of the KKK use masterfully those metaphors that, on the one hand, implied the threat of violence, which did not occur.
Yeah.
So how do they balance this perilous tight
Yeah.
between an implicit threat and explicit statements covered in the mantle of metaphors?
Yeah. They were very good at metaphors. And again, the pages of the Fiery Cross are full of, as nonsensical as it is, full of kind of great metaphors and great statements and little similes and all sorts of tricks of the trade. I lost my train of thought there.
We're talking about the masterful metaphors.
Yeah. They just had they knew what they were doing. They were really salesmen. They were advertising people, some of them. They made their own films, by the way. They knew about audiences and reception. They were brilliant at creating these enemies, and they were always the victims. The Klan was always the victim of these enemies. The newspaper's full of this. Students at Notre Dame rioted against the Klan when it held a rally there in 1924. Well, the newspaper went on for weeks and weeks talking about the Catholic riot in South Bend, Indiana, and how many Klan members were beaten up and almost died, and this danger, this threat from fighting Catholics, fighting Irish, drunken Irish, all the other stuff just fills the pages of the newspaper and the speeches. I have a different notion, a different example. I have a quotation. A speaker in Noblesville, Indiana, a Klan organizer and speaker, promised the audience in Noblesville that the Klan was going to build a wall around America to keep out immigrants. Good stuff that hasn't gone away.
But the Klan is dying out, is it not? Even the Southern Poverty
Yes.
Law admits
Yeah.
that
Yes.
there are only about 40.
Yeah, it depends how you count them, and they come and go. Yeah, they come and go. They can't organize themselves out of a box. They're just a bunch of doofuses today, and that's good. And let's hope it stays that way. These other organizations, these other militia type organizations and white racist organizations are a little more sophisticated. I follow in the book Matt Heimbach from Paoli, Indiana, who was one of the major organizers of the Charlottesville rally in 2017, where there were good people on both sides, we were told. But beyond the Klan, Carolyn, I think personally, and I'm speaking to Susan now, that the threat today comes not from men and women in robes and hoods, but from men in very nice tailored suits and women in silk blouses who stand up and sound very persuasive, but are really using the dog whistles and the coded words very similar to the actual words and certainly the message that the Klan used in the 1920s. They don't say we're 100% Americans, but that's what they're implying when they talk about other people. And there's an awful lot of that in white America in 2021, and it's not going away. Now, let me make one final point, and then I'll stop pontificating here. But the Klan of the 20s, what we saw on January 6th this year, this did not just appear out of nowhere. This is American history. It's been with us forever in all sorts of ways. It may wax and wane, but it's always been part of America, and it's not going to go away this year or in 2024. The question is, what do we do about it as Americans?
We're nearing the end of the hour, and we do want to have an opportunity for our audience members to pose questions should they have questions for us. But
okay. Hi, thank you. I've been writing down some of the questions as they have come up, so I'll start you off with a couple here. This is just a really big one. It was one of the first ones that was asked, but how do you think the government should deal with the far right today?
I'm going to let Carolyn. You want to have a response to that, Carolyn? Well, I think.
Well, I would like to offer a page from Nelson Mandela. I am very fond of Nelson Mandela. And I watched the movie Invictus. Some of you probably saw that movie.
Mm-hmm.
When I heard the name Invictus, I had an immediate connectivity to Nelson Mandela, because as a young girl growing up in a one traffic light blink and it's gone kind of southern town in Louisiana, that was one poem we had to recite, Invictus, out of the night that covers me. So I love the idea that in that film, Nelson Mandela's public embrace of rugby, a sport highly symbolic of Afrikaans culture and history, served him well. I love the idea that Nelson Mandela said, we're going to honor the land of this country, the mimosa trees, the beautiful soil. My point is that Nelson Mandela said, we can reconcile our differences by sharing common ground and by recategorizing human beings. And it seems to me that recategorization is what we need to be about in the United States of America. Seeing an individual as a human person, as opposed to seeing that individual as a Democrat or a Republican, but rather a human being who happens to be a Democrat. So that's what I try to do, and I try to preach from my pulpit in my classes when I talk about transforming divided communities, the idea of recategorizing people and seeing them as human beings, and then giving other people the opportunity to disagree with what we say, but at the same time, to see those individuals as political friends. I love the book Talking to Strangers by Danielle Allen. He talks about this notion of political friendship. And of course, it has its roots in Aristotle and the classics as well, talking to people in a lovely way. So that would be my offering.
Okay, here's another question.
I'll follow that, talking to people and allowing them to disagree. I want to point out, those of you who follow Indiana politics, what happened on Thursday last week in the Indiana General Assembly, where white members of the Indiana General Assembly refused to allow African Americans to speak, and some of them left the room. It was an outrageous assault on decency and on democracy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And part of the answer to the comment, to the question, I think, has to do with our democracy, because it creates real problems for us about how we disagree and how we deal with dissent and how we deal with opposition. The other issue in our democracy is that we have this rule of law. You can't just round up people because they disagree with us. Thank God. You could in pre-Mandela South Africa, but those issues, those tensions are built into democracy. At the end of the day, you can't have a democracy without civility, without human decency. And right now, last week in the Indiana General Assembly, we did not have that. And I would hope, we talked earlier about leadership, I would hope that our political leaders in Indiana, especially in the Republican Party, which is in charge, are going to step up and really put more than just a wrist slap on those members of the General Assembly last week. Sorry. Okay, go ahead, Patsy.
Yeah, here's another one. It says, didn't an Indianapolis newspaper win a Pulitzer for reporting about the Klan's influence in Indiana in about 1927? Dr. Madison, do you know anything more about this story?
Yes, I write about this. This is the Indianapolis Times, which was a great newspaper and did indeed do an investigative report on the Klan and won the Pulitzer Prize in 1928. I wish, however, there were lots of Indiana newspapers like that. There were not. There was a few others, but most newspapers were silent or supportive of the Klan.
We also have another question. Can we really talk about progress when we live in the greatest police terror carceral state in the world? Isn't the Lincoln last best hope comment a pseudo justification for American/white supremacists throughout the world? Yeah. That's a loaded question.
That's a tough one, and I'll let everyone have their own opinion on that one. I understand the question. I would never say America is a perfect nation or perfect democracy, ever, ever, ever. What I said was hope, the possibility.
This comment and question would like your thoughts about the fact that this person taught at Bloomington South. A few students actually had Confederate flags as their background computer wallpaper, and when asked, said they viewed it as their heritage. Thoughts?
There's a technical word for that. It's bullshit. That was quick.
Well, just a little bit of context here. The Confederate battle flag, I believe, is the flag of white supremacy. as a flag of racism. It was not valued as heritage or anything else until the civil rights movement scared a lot of whites in the 1960s into saying, we need to do something, we need to stand up. And one of the major symbols they latched onto was that battle flag. And they started in late 50s and 60s to fly it, and they still fly it. Now, some people don't understand that. I can see that. And they think it's other things. I'm just being smart ass. I'm a rebel, blah, blah, blah. But the truth is very, very painful. And that flag, the image of that flag inside the Capitol, our nation's Capitol on January 6th, angered me more than anything else that happened that day.
All right, this is, was the Indiana KKK stronger in one region of the state or equally active throughout Indiana? And if so, why?
Well, there were Klaverns in all 92 counties by 1924. There were more in central and northern Indiana than southern Indiana, because southern Indiana at that point was almost entirely Democratic. Central and northern Indiana were Republican, and the Klan chose, and the Republican Party chose the Klan as their partnership. Democrats wavered not so much. And so it was partly because of the strong Republican strength in central and northern Indiana that the Klan had more support there. But there were Klan Klaverns all across southern Indiana, including Bloomington.
We have another question. I've done some work on white supremacist websites, and many groups like Storefront and Aryan Nation seem linked to an idea about the Nazis and racist fascism. Could you say something about the links between the Klan and the other white supremacist groups? The Klan seems homegrown, while the other groups come from other traditions, but in the US, they seem to connect around racist ideology.
Well, I think the US ones today are homegrown too, just like the Klan was. I have been on some of those websites. It's painful to do it, but when I was writing this book, I felt I needed to look at those websites. And I was rather astonished, amused to find that Stormfront, one of the major ones, had a Klan. The Klan made phonograph records in Richmond, Indiana at Jeanette Studios. And the Klan, one of the Klan records, a version of Onward Christian Soldiers, was available to listen to on the Stormfront website. It may still be, just a year or two ago when I discovered it, and all sorts of other Klan stuff on these right-wing, white, racist websites. So as we said earlier, the Klan was very powerful in creating these images, this identity. And it can cause trauma in African Americans and for all of us, but it can also cause an appeal that the right-wing racists can relate to today.
Speaking of today, this was actually part of a second part to the earlier question. He talks about in the city of Bloomington a couple summers ago, there were white supremacists at the farmers market, and the city talked about it as they had the right to be there because of First Amendment rights. And the question was this a necessary or justifiable way of framing the issue? And what might have been a better way to handle that, or a way to handle the fact that there were farmers who were connected to white supremacists?
Well, we all followed that issue. And I was uncertain myself, and I was glad I didn't have to make the decision, because on the one hand, I believe in freedom of speech and all the other freedoms guaranteed to us by our Constitution. I believe in those more strongly, I think, than many Americans do. I'm reluctant to limit anyone's rights. I wish there had been other ways to deal with that than the ways it was dealt with, and the kind of fumbling responses to it over a long period of time. It created a lot of bad feelings. It created a lot of bad publicity for Bloomington. I hope we've recovered from it and will continue to recover from it. But that's the kind of problem that's implicit in democracy. If we're going to have freedom, we're going to have problems.
So was the Indiana KKK stronger in one region of the state or equally active throughout Indiana?
Well, it was especially strong in the old, not the old, at that time, the new industrial cities and towns, Indianapolis, Anderson, Kokomo, Newcastle, Muncie. Those were booming industrial cities in the 1920s. And also cities that were attracting African Americans and Jewish newcomers and Catholic workers and foreign workers. And all of these new people showing up at the dance caused traditional white people to look and say, whoa, something's happening here. It's not good. We've got to do something. And joining the Klan is a way to keep them in their place.
Jim, I don't see any additional questions in the chat room, so I want to ask a question here if I
Sure.
may, before we leave. You've had multiple opportunities to give presentations on the Klan throughout the state of Indiana. And it is likely that there are individuals in the audience, this is where you speak, who may be the progeny of individuals who were very, very active in the Klan. What have been your encounters with people as you speak throughout the country on this issue of the Klan?
Well, I've often run into people who say, I think my grandfather, or I know my grandmother, my great uncle, great uncle was a member of the Klan. We found this and that. And I tell them, that's not your problem, really. It may be a family issue, but you didn't join the Klan. However, you have an obligation, as we all do, to learn what it was, to think what it fits, where it fits, and how you today think about these issues, and why I hope you'll disagree with your my great-great-grandfather fought for the Confederacy in the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia. And I finally have found his grave, and I'm going to put, when I get to the Shenandoah Valley the next time, I'm going to put an American flag on his grave and try to redeem his treasonous fight against the United States of America. We all have in our families individuals who made the wrong choices.
So Jim, did you have more in mind when you penned the title of your book, KKK in the Heartland? I'm still struck by in the Heartland.
Well,
were you merely saying geographically they were in the Heartland, or were you saying more than that?
Well, I think I was. I spent it, it's hard to get a title for a book. You know this, Carolyn. Gosh, I went through lots of possibilities. What I'm saying was what the argument of the book is. As American as apple pie. I mean, the Heartland is the heart of the nation, and it's the Midwest in particular. Mm-hmm. It's not those crazy places like Alabama or even Louisiana where you grew up, Mm-hmm. It's the most American of America. That's always been the myth we've told ourselves here in Indiana and the Midwest and in other parts of the nation. And so if you have an organization like this that's as American as apple pie and yet as dark as the night, maybe a reader ought to read this book, and a thinker and a citizen ought to study and think about these issues and where they fit today.
I was going to ask as a last question, what next? Where else can you go with regard to the Klan?
Well, I don't know. I'm kind of finished with the Klan. It was a long 3 years writing about the Klan. You felt like you were working in a sewer sometimes. I've long been obsessed with issues of division, of us and them, particularly around matters of race. Mm-hmm. And those issues are more salient today than I think they've ever been. There's a lot of scholarship on there, scholars smarter than I am writing about issues of race. Mm-hmm. But I may not have had the last word on this subject. We'll see.
And finally, I had wanted to ask you, if you had to boil your book down to a single phrase, what would it be? And now I'm thinking it would be the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s was as dark as the night and as American as apple pie. Am I right or wrong?
I'm gonna stick with that one, Carolyn. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jim. This has been a lovely, lovely opportunity for me to have a conversation with you and for us to join other individuals across the state and having this conversation about the Ku Klux Klan in the Heartland.
Thank you, Cal. And thank you for reading the book. Not everyone who talks to me about the book and has great questions or not so great questions has read the book, but you read the book and you had
Yes.
great questions. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you both.
Patsy,
Jim,
Ron, and the
Carolyn, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming today, and we'll see you next time.